Yeah, so we would like to invite our first guest, members of the collective Terra Zero, Paul Kolling, that is also an author of one of the works that you can see within the exhibition, and Christopher Dake-Outhet, yeah?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
They will talk about their project, which is related to DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, in which they play with like human and non-human actors. So I think that it will be, you know, like really great continuity from the last evening, finishing with growing your own cloud, and we will talk a little bit later about this possibilities of using blockchain and this alternative thinking of how to give voice in frame of the climate change problems and ecological issues to the actors that maybe cannot communicate so easily with us. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey. First of all, thanks for inviting us. I must say, we have structured our talk now as a kind of brief overview over Terra Zero, and maybe first like an explanation what Terra Zero is. However, we structured it chronologically, and we are working on this for over 6 years now in various formations, and also with various intentions. And so this doesn't go too much into the technical aspects, which got introduced by Bartek right now, but it's rather like a rough overview of like what, more like an artist talk, like our artistic practice and like what's our political stake in this topic. However, I'm happy to be interrupted at any time if you have any questions or if you want to discuss certain aspects, so don't wait to the end, just like raise your hand and we can discuss. So first, what is Terra Zero? It starts with, this is where it gets confusing, because it is 3 different things basically, and we were clever enough to name them all the same, and also kind of lost track, or kind of using it like interchangeable. So it is an artwork, a conceptual artwork which is ever evolving, which we started in 2015 to develop. It is also a research group which is not only consisting out of us, the core team, but also various people contributing. We have kind of a network of friends who are like actively involved, exchanging over like a certain set of ideas. And then it's also an art collective, so we do make artworks which are then shown in exhibitions and then also used to communicate or transport the ideas of the research collective. So yeah, it started in 2015, and we published it first in 2016, and was based on a joint research between Paul Seidler and me. We were studying together with in the class of Joachim Sauter at the Berlin University of Art, and I was interested in notions of nature and culture, and was reading a lot of Flüsse and where, like, if there's like a division or not. And Paul was doing research in new financial infrastructure, blockchains, and was specifically interested in the way how identity is suddenly not necessarily linked to a human or like a legal person, a natural or legal person. And we had like lengthy talks and then combined it in a research paper, or like we called it a white paper. It's technically not a white paper. We kind of LARPed into this scientific thing again, where we described how an ecosystem, in our case a forest, can own itself or become economically sovereign. And the foundation of this was the idea that if you look at the history of law and personhood, then especially in European law, it's always linked to personhood is always linked to the ability to own something. And this is completely wrong in legal terms, but we dilettantly thought, okay, if we can augment something non-human, something not defined as a legal person, to be able to own something, then there must come some sort of personhood with it. With blockchain technology, suddenly a program or a daemon or something could own capital or could own means, and this was like what sparked the whole Terra Zero idea. And so we picked the kind of also very German cultural heavy connotation of like the forest, which is like the if you look at the German literature or German history, always like the notion of like the natural, like the ideal of the natural, whatever that should mean. And at the same time, it's like a very important industry and space for exploitation, for natural exploitation. And we thought if we kind of proposed a way where this exploitation, which happens through human parties normally, gets automated, and then the accumulated capital is used to buy the forest or like the space where the exploitation happens in order to either stop the exploitation or generate endless capital based on like ecological growth. And it sparked a lot of discussion. It was kind of amazing because we put it out and it immediately divided like the audience in two parts. Like there was like this part who were just like, oh, this is great. This is like suddenly like a sovereign way to fund rewilding, natural preservation zones and stuff like this. And the other part was like, were more like people anthropomorphizing the forest and be like, oh, this is cruel. You force a forest to chop down its own tree. It's like, you force it to hurt itself. And there were really strong reactions. So we presented this paper on the Transmediale in Berlin, and there were people leaving the room and got really upset and were like, oh, you're on something really dangerous. You have to stop doing this. And this is kind of like an affirmation that we're kind of onto something interesting. And I think it's important to tell now that at this point we never designed this to save the world or with like the thought to create something inherently good. It was always clear that we kind of created like a framework which could be used either ways. But that was also the reason why we thought it's interesting and important to iterate in an artistic means to be able to position oneself and not to just like, I don't know, wait till like some industry picks up this and appropriates this as a startup. The problem was that there was not so much interest from like an art realm in like these technologies, and the development of this to try it out was extremely cost intensive. So we were always invited to like smaller art shows, but like there was never a way where people would give us the financial means to actually realize this. And this was kind of like a hard time. We were working for like 2-3 years and got invited to a lot of shows, but then there was never really production. I mean, like not production budget to test it out. It was still a theory. And also this theory, or like our framework, would only work on a large scale because it would rely on like the analysis of satellite image data and other resource material, which is only financially feasible if you go very large scale. Because like if you want to buy high-res satellite data, for example, as like an end consumer, then you have to buy like huge charts which cost like thousands of euros. And if you only have like a small plot of land which you want to analyze with, doesn't make sense to have like an image of whole Brandenburg, which you can't use. And also like the the computation and analysis of like this data is then very cost intensive, and so we were kind of stuck in having like an interesting thought, but like we're never able to.
Also, like the mechanics of the value generation in this was the trees cutting down themselves, which is what caused a lot of controversy with the ecological purists, because like the idea is that you're creating some sort of incentive for like ecocide of the forest or something like this. Which also like made it a better art project, because it did sort of like have this sort of like critical mechanism built into it, where it's like, you know, if you don't do this, I'm gonna like commit like ecological suicide, and the forest cuts itself down. So I would say like this sort of created the baseline for also like a lot of other iterations of TerraZero over the years, because like we had to deal with the sort of repercussions if this was going to become a real project. That sort of thing, as interesting as it was as sort of like an art project, couldn't actually function as like a real world implementation of TerraZero, because it's just irresponsible to have like a forest just, you know, especially there was some mechanics built into the tokens where like it would have to be automated to basically do it whether it was good for the environment or not.
Yeah, so we thought like, how should we proceed? And the solution we came up with was, okay, we can't like realize it now on full scale, but there are certain aspects which are interesting and which we kind of want to look at. And if we don't have the means to iterate it once for all, then we split it apart and make smaller test case, which are feasible to realize with like a smaller budget, and then create like a set of findings which then can be used either by others or by us in future experiments. And our first project was then flower tokens, which dealt with, okay, how do markets work if the underlying asset which is traded on the market is undergoing an internal growth through, or like an ecological growth. So normally you have resources which are completely passive, like, I don't know, like gold or like raw materials or for example, like a fixed amount of like a certain energy type. But still you have like market dynamics, and it's like complex in its own way. But we thought like, what if like the underlying, like the traded asset actually is linked to like an individual plant? We of course thought of trees, but like that was something we couldn't realize. And so we created this very, very super small test scale where we made like a micro market and built this setup where you can see it was situated in a co-working space in Berlin, and it was a grow rack where we put in 100 flowers and tokenized all of these flowers with an individual token, and then created like, this is the marketplace we built. We created a space where people could acquire these tokens. They were sold for exactly each was sold for exactly 1/100th of like the production cost of like this shelf. So it was, I think, like 25 euros or 30 euros per plant. And you could buy the an ERC 721 token, which is an NFT, but then back then it was not really standardized as an NFT, or like the NFT standard, for example, from OpenSea wasn't around. And we had like these pots where like, there was like one plant seed in it. And then we tracked how people would trade plants according to their growth and through their biological development. And the interesting part was that from the trading, like every time somebody would trade their token, a certain fee would go to the blooming pool, and the blooming pool is reserved for the plant, like the owners of tokens which hold plants which would bloom. So like there was also like this gamified asset that like every week we got like a record and see like if there's like one flowering plant, and If so, they could like win the blooming pool, and this was made to incentivize active trading according to different plant growth. What's also interesting about this basically is talking to a core problem of every blockchain project called the Oracle problem. Like blockchain stuff works great if you stay within the blockchain, and whenever you have to kind of like interface the real world, you have a problem to make sure everything is synced up. So, for example, we could just like sell a token of a plant, but if somebody buys this token and is not in Berlin, how would they know that like his plant or their plant actually exists? We kind of like not solved it, but like our way to address it was to make this installation as an artwork in a public space, and had a live stream which could then verify it by going there in person. But of course this is very clumsy, it only works on like a small scale. But it's, for us, this was in 2018, and as far as I know, it's the first NFT collectible project which kind of tries to link a digital collectible to a physical object.
Like, I guess you could also talk about the Oracle problem as an extension of trust, which was being mentioned before on the blockchain. A lot of people think it's some sort of like automatic sort of trust of transactions, but then that only works if it's like intrinsic to the actual blockchain itself. So anything that's happening outside of it, you have to create new systems to be trusted that get real world data to be able to put onto a blockchain in the first place, which, you know, you have to still make some sort of community or system to be able to transfer that data or information in a way where people can actually trust it, that it's real. Also, in the original white paper that we were showing before, it predates the sort of NFT Ethereum standards. So this was also a challenge to try to use, it mostly just used tokens as an economy, and it would just use them as sort of its own currency to try to manage itself, but none of the trees, or at the time, there wasn't really the possibility to sort of like create individual assets for individual ecological entities on the blockchain at that time. So it deals more with the economy of just an intrinsic currency to an ecological zone.
And fittingly, the co-working space where Flower Tokens was situated is called Trust. So it's actually like a great space. It's not a typical co-working space, but rather a space where different theorists, artists, and researchers meet up, and they have like talks there. And so also a great website. They have like a lecture series. If you're ever in Berlin, you should definitely check it out. Trust. I think the website is called trust.support. Yeah.
You can also join them. I'm just going to maybe plug.
Yeah.
You can join Trust and be part of their Discord. It's a really good Discord to be part of, and they do a lot of interesting events as well, on their Discord mostly, if it's virtual. And IRL if you're in Berlin.
Yeah. So then there's, the next project was Premna Demon. It was our first work in an institute, like in a proper art institution. It was commissioned for a show called Proof of Work, created by Simon Denny at the Schinkel Pavillon in Berlin. And this was, as you can see, it's a bonsai tree or a little plant, which is surrounded by a kind of frame with cables attached, which go through to a series of cameras, and a web interface and like a digital version of it. And in this time, we thought a lot about, we had discussions about these like unpaid ecosystem services, which means that they're like every ecosystem provides services for humans which are normally just like accepted but not really or they are valorized but like not really appreciated in many ways, and they're kind of like these they're incorporated into like financial dependencies and economic dependencies, and in the same time this is very opaque and it's really hard to see what kind of also economic benefit we have from, for example, a tree growing outside in the street. And there was an interesting book from the 80s from Friedrich Wester, a German ecologist and biologist, called Der Wert eines Vogels, which translates to the value of a bird, where he looked at a small little, I forgot the English name, but a small little Blaukehle, a small little singbird, and literally iterated through like the economic worth of this bird. And it's kind of like a very cruel approach, which he made like published like very critically. But it was interesting because he start with like the material value of like this raw material which are like in this bird, like they're like tiny amounts of like iron, for example, and calcium. And then he goes through his service as like a pesticide and pest control, and his contribution to a stable ecosystem, which would otherwise be force like farmers, for example, to buy chemical pesticides, towards even like his recreational surplus in creating joy in people listening to this little bird singing and maybe being like a little bit more productive afterwards in their working in the factory, which is a very interesting thought. And this is also something difficult because we're not propagating to valorize every part of the ecosystem, but I think it's important to acknowledge that everything has an economic value, if we want it or not, because that's like that's the system we are living in, and it's kind of like important to de-romanticize the notion of that there just exists something pure for like a pure, I don't know, like pure natural sake or something. And we created this little plant and said, okay, this plant can't exist on its own, and it will not receive any services it didn't pay for, or like, so we set up a contract with the gallery and said, okay, you have to care for this plant, but only if the plant pays for this very service. And then we created this web interface where people could go on the website, see the available resources, and tip the plant money for being able to pay for the watering or for the trimming or the electricity, or even like to upkeep the server infrastructure where the backend would run. And then the plant, or like the system we built, it was based on Ethereum. Back then, Ethereum was kind of very low price. Right now, it would have made a fortune. And then the plant automatically, there was like a little computer underneath it, taking measurements of the plant and then deciding what kind of services to acquire from the gallery, and then it would ping a gallery assistant, pay for its service, and then receive the service. And what's interesting about this is that it also creates a very interesting social aspect. So you have like a publicly displayed plant, and like the well-being of it is dependent on favors. So nowadays, naturally, we're coming to this later, you would just be like, okay, give this plant $1 and you receive an NFT, which is a speculative asset, and you probably can sell it for $3 in 2 weeks. Back then, we didn't thought in this way, and NFTs weren't really around, definitely not as collectibles. And so like all these transactions were one-way transactions. This was just like purely, okay, I see that this plant needs water. Will I pay for its watering, or will I let it suffer? So it's kind of like it's like a communal, real-life Tamagotchi setting.
Yeah, I think it like I mean, all the iterations that are done through TerraZero really pay attention to like the locality that the project is oriented in. This one's sort of like a manufactured, like in the context of the art gallery,
where we still had a lot of interest in like having like, hey, do you want to be part of the show? But then we were like, hey, would you fund our research? And then it would be like, nah, can't really. Do you have something to put on the wall? And then we actually decided, okay, maybe it is the most important thing is to communicate an idea, and this is now our job. And so we started creating objects which work in a gallery space and museum space, and we created 2 sets of objects. One are like the 3 morphology panels. They are pretty much typical gallery wall objects, and they consist out of a metal frame, a powder-coated metal frame, which has the baseline like mechanisms of the initial white paper inscribed and CNC milled into the outside. So all these 3 frames can be used as keys to really understand the whole project, what's happening there. I can show you like the diagrams later. But in the same time, we knew, okay, we kind of need to make something which is intriguing for people who are not maybe so technologically literate and need some more guiding to get into this project. And so this is also something which is important for us to acknowledge, that like you kind of have to I don't know, like to pick people up where they are and can't overwhelm them with like too much information, even though you work maybe on something for a long time. And so the centerpiece of all these things are just like sceneries in the forest and include a very simple metaphor. It combines like the machine vision and the human vision. So I sent a photographer in the forest and ordered him to make 3 photos with a large format camera, and in the same time scan the forest with a LiDAR scanner and create a 3D model of it. And I was traveling through China working on a piece you can see upstairs back then, so I had to do it remote. And he would send me both data sets. I would recreate the forest he was in a couple of hours earlier digitally, and recreate his large format camera virtually, and then take the same photo he took in real life virtually from like the data sets collected by the LiDAR scanner, and then framed the photos behind the glass onto which I printed the rendered image. It's confusing to understand if I talk about it now, but it creates like a very simple and nice, pleasing parallax effect of these sceneries. And the other one is something which we came up, which is an ongoing series, which is also a very simple narrative. It's a workwear jacket, which, as a speculative object, which workers would wear being employed by the Terra Zero system. And the nice thing about them is that they're very cheaply produced. It's just like the most common and most cheapest version of worker's jacket, and then embroidered with a claim, a logo, and that's it. And we're using this because we are exhibiting not in like smaller spaces, but in like very different countries, and like many different countries and many different places in the world. And you kind of have to justify shipping big heavy crates all over the world, or have it, you know, like it's also, you have to consider your own footprint in like this artwork. And so we created this to have a project which is like ever evolving. So like we have like this ever, like an accumulation of like different workwear jackets, which also reflect like the different localities, which is kind of
like nice. The production, the aesthetics are based within the environment, the locality they're created in. So if it's in Canada, it was like flannel.
Yeah.
And they're just sourced from whatever can be made around that sort of area. It's also like the ongoing idea of like flipping the hierarchy of like who works for whom within sort of like the environment. Like can we create a system where we end up working for like some sort of like ecological entity, and like have that relationship sort of be transposed into some sort of like long-term working relationship in general?
Yeah, I'm just seeing like you kind of have to give me a sign when we come to an end, because I think we just like stop at one point, but I would just continue until somebody raised their hand a little bit more. I don't know, like if we were running out of time, you have to tell me.
Maybe slowly, but yeah.
Okay, we stretch it a little. This was actually our first. It was not our first NFT. The first NFT we made were the flower tokens, but back then, I mean, like what you can see in the name of flower tokens, we came up with like an own name because like there was the frame, like the term NFT wasn't coined then. We got approached by a major auction house last year to create like the major, like the first major, or like to be included in the first major auction of NFTs in like the traditional art market. And we thought a long time if we should participate or not. And on one hand, of course, it's like a way to finance your practice, but on the other side, it's like the question if you want to participate in like this, I don't know, like this, this whole, I don't know, like the whole NFT run, and where it's kind of like also where we realized the whole medium gets completely, like what we're thinking is interesting in this medium gets completely ignored or abandoned, and like it's only like a purely speculative asset of digital assets, but like there's like hardly any NFTs out there anymore which really deal with like the underlying infrastructure or the medium in itself, but rather using it as like a pure stupid vehicle. And so we thought, of course you can't do something like flower tokens in this setting because this is too experimental, so it needs to be like some one of a kind, it needs to work as like a traditional NFT, but we thought like, okay, how can we change it just like a tiny bit so it becomes something interesting, and research a little bit more what's actually happening, or like what actually like this, the technology does allow, which wasn't possible before blockchain tech. And so we created an NFT which becomes burnable once NASA published, their average surface global temperature every year, and once they publish that it's like above 2 degrees above average, this asset becomes burnable. And I mean, like this is a little bit like wrongly phrased to make it more catchy, but it doesn't burn itself. It's passive, but like there's what kind of law is this? That like whatever is possible or like whatever can go wrong will go wrong. Like we kind of trust that like whenever it's possible to burn it, there will be someone out on the internet to destroy this speculative asset. And the idea is a little bit of if NFTs can maybe augment the artist and redistribute a little bit of agency again, and make them make it possible for an artist to have a stake in the political opinion, for example, of their collector. Because normally, you know, artists create artwork and then they sell them, and in the best case they get like a lot of money to fund their practice, but then they're completely detached from what's happening. They're most of the time detached from secondary sales, but also they become like this passive thing which a collector hangs on their wall. And so with this, we thought it's kind of interesting to offer a speculative asset to a collector. However, it comes with their like strings attached. We kind of like incorporate a political stance in it, and with like the underlying idea being like, okay, now somebody spent a lot of money to get this this artwork in their collection, and now if no matter what's their political position, now they have an interest, or like at least suffer a little bit more if the climate rise. And so maybe this can be, I mean, like, this is of course like a very upfront and maybe like more like to be seen as a metaphor. But maybe if you think about, for example, if the existence of an artwork is suddenly linked to, I don't know, like a squatted building, for example, in a town, make it more locally. And then suddenly, if you have, you can maybe use this to, I don't know, to intentionally team up with like somebody who has power and money, and suddenly create an interest or an incentive for them to take a stance in like in a local decision.
It also like embodies the sort of more macro, like environmental, economic conditions of what is more powerful, like punishment or reward, when it comes to incentivization. I think that's still like an ongoing conversation, but this also links the actual destruction of the real world to it as well. So it's a little bit broader than just like the economic conditions, which do have that built in, but sometimes not so overtly.
Funnily, this artwork was also something which we then exhibited for a number of times in virtual spaces. I think this is kind of a temporal phenomenon, but like last year there was like this hype where people would then contact us, be like, hey, we're making this metaverse show. And I included it because I think it's really interesting. I'm not like neglecting that this maybe has some future. I think it is truly interesting, but with everything new which comes up, there's like kind of like an intrinsic clumsiness which still needs to be dissolved. I have no idea how, but I do think like these are kind of like artifacts of like a very specific point of time, and I'm like really happy to be part
I mean,
of this.
in blockchain and all this as well, it seems like there's sort of like this dichotomy between like building in and building out. Like, are we making the metaverse, or are we making some system to like exist outside of it? And it's sort of an ongoing conversation of like how we're going to orient our lives through technology in general, and what takes precedence.
I would maybe suggest to wrap it up here, because the next project is a little bit longer again.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So maybe now I will ask Cyrus to come and to present the work and ideas related to the work of the collective Grow Your Own Cloud. So Cyrus is a designer, futurist, one of the founders of this collective Grow Your Own Cloud. And we are presenting within the exhibition the work Data Garden. And recently they are also developing an idea to use blockchain and DAO as a kind of possibility, and testing this possibility to develop the collective and the idea as a part of the blockchain initiative and a new web free tree.
Okay. How's it going? Sorry again for being late. I really apologize. I'm not that much of a diva. I wasn't trying to be like a rock star coming in late or something. I just really thought I was on at 11:45. And super nice to hear from Terra Zero, because I've been following their work for quite some time now, but we've never crossed paths, so it's good that we finally do. And actually, we share so much in common, I think. Obviously in thematic, like trying to work with nature, but also in terms of the struggle of how to manifest an artistic vision without the means. And yesterday we spoke quite a lot about that. We did another talk yesterday with Monica, and we basically delved more into what Grow Your Own Cloud is, and the whole history, and how we went from basically having this artistic vision to where we are today. My talk today is more about what we're doing with regards to Web3, and how we're utilizing it as Grow Your Own Cloud, and the kind of rationale for that, because I think it's something that's been quite considered, we didn't jump into that by any means. So it's interesting, I think, to share that, and it's interesting for me to kind of also piece that together for this talk. So the talk is called Grow Your Own DAO. Our project is obviously called Grow Your Own Cloud. And what we do in this project a lot is puns and play on words, because I like to do that. So just very quick recap. I'm sorry for those of you who are here yesterday who already know stuff about Grow Your Own Cloud. But for those who were not here yesterday, we now call ourselves a green biotech company. We've gone through the same struggle as you in having multiple things and different structures and all those kinds of issues. But now we're trying to be a bit more like straightforward in our approach and our definition. And what we do is basically store data in plants. And we have a mission which is transform data centers from carbon creators into carbon absorbers by working with nature as a technology. And the work we've been doing really encompasses design, technology, science, and very much always working with nature in a multidisciplinary way. And that's led to us doing some really interesting research, getting some good recognition, being recognized, especially by people within the synthetic biology industry, which is quite amazing for an artistic project like this, basically. Okay. It's just very slow. So just a really quick recap of our history. We started out by doing the lowest possible, easiest possible thing, which was to transform a flower shop into a decentralized data center. This was completely fictitious. People came in with USB sticks of data. We used real science, but kind of performed it in the shop to show them how they could store data in plants. And everyone loved it. So then we continued. And we managed to get the means to actually do some experiments and store data in real plants, and more importantly, retrieve it. And we developed the data garden, which is upstairs. And that was our first proof of concept. And from there, we started doing more kind of commercial work, proof of concepts with companies like this, which is with LVMH in Paris, where we, again, worked with storing their precious archives from the LVMH repertoire, like Christian Dior and that kind of stuff, in plants, and presenting it to their C-suite people. And this is the kind of trajectory we've been on, and now we've been on Netflix. So the project is kind of going in an escalating manner, which is good for us, and we're happy with the kind of the trajectory. But the North Star of the project has always been, like, can we actually make this real? What would it take to make this real? And before that, of course, our work as a designer, as an artist, was about setting the ethical parameters for doing this work, rather than just saying, let's just make plants which store data. So we feel confident that we're doing the right thing and going in the right way. And the reason we're doing that is, of course, because we heard yesterday, data centers, bad for the environment, emit tons of CO2. Potentially working with DNA data storage could reduce that, and working with plants offers another paradigm on top of that, which is carbon absorption. And through our research, we've actually managed to encode store data in plants, which wasn't new, but was new in the way we did it, and decoding data from the plants, which was brand new to like science and the world in general. So we're quite proud of that. And we thought, well, since we've developed that technology, actually we've kind of gone beyond what an art project typically does. Maybe we can commercialize this and actually run this organization, something between a startup and a research organization, which funds itself and allows us to push forward on the vision we have, which is, I think, similar to what you're thinking of doing. And where we're at with the technology is basically the early stages of computing. Today we can store kilobytes, fragments of data, which is basically JPEG and MP3, something like that. Not very impressive, not very useful, symbolic data. But in the future, we might be able to store megabytes and gigabytes of data in plants and DNA and other organisms, which would be a bit more useful, a bit more impressive. Maybe there's commercial properties there. And in the far future, we could actually get to something which goes beyond conventional data centers, where we can store petabytes of data, because DNA is incredibly dense. And that really, again, completely changes the paradigm of data storage, because we go from having data centers, which are really, really enormous buildings, which consume tons of material, lots of energy, and emit lots of CO2, to like liquids. You can store a lot of data in that vase, basically. This clicker does not like me. Oh my god. So we're here. So yeah, that's basically our vision. We're trying to get from that trajectory of kilobytes of data today to petabytes in the future, where we go from server farms, which are really useful and obviously really helpful and great in many ways. But we want to get to data forests as a kind of complement to the server farm. And data forest by no means means like just trees. This could be any type of organism, an ecosystem of data, but in a biological format. So basically, that was our talk from yesterday, but much shorter. In summary, what we're trying to do is build a moonshot. You're trying to build a moonshot too. The thing is that we are not Google. We are not like hardcore entrepreneurs, startup bros. We are artists or designers with this vision. And how can we then finance this project if we are not that kind of personal organization? How can we actually develop this? And how can we do that in the right way? And how can we coordinate and build it with the values that we care about? And how can we bring in people to actually work with us and drive the network effects that are required to create something like this and make it extend beyond like a gallery or a website? And then how can we actually, if this does work, how do we govern the project and the company following that? How can we make sure it doesn't just fall into another kind of failed, bad ethics scenario startup and replicate the existing system and potentially be worse because now we're playing with biology? Oh my god. All right. It's really tricky. I cannot click through. No, not when I'm in presenter mode.
Because maybe it has, you know, like the moment of down, the down one.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe it has also like, you know,
Delay. Yeah. All right. So that brings me to something completely off kilter. So basically, I've been like exploring blockchain since 2015, and I could never reconcile my explorations of blockchain with grow your own cloud for, I think, relatively obvious reasons. But if the main reason is like the ecological impact of blockchain, which from the beginning was always like an issue to me. But at the same time, I didn't want to stop myself exploring that, and I'm not against blockchain being explored and created, or even Bitcoin like becoming a global currency for that reason. It's just that the two worlds couldn't coexist. And instead, what I thought would be interesting to do would be to educate people on the potential future of blockchain. So I created this, which is called What the Block, which is an educational game. Oh, come on. Yeah, it's an educational game which basically teaches people how to use blockchain via Lego, via a physical metaphor for what the blockchain is, because the blockchain for so many people is just super abstract, and we can talk about it, we can explain it via words, you can try to show people diagrams, nobody understands it at all. Like the first time, it took me hours of YouTube, it probably took you hours of the same YouTube and reading to get it, and many people just don't want to do that. So I made this Lego game. In about 20 minutes, people understand pretty much everything they need to know about blockchain just by playing with Lego and some cards, and it works. And that led to me creating What the Block, which ends up being like this side project which helps me fund Grow Your Own Cloud as a kind of blockchain design studio, going around playing the game, teaching thousands of people what blockchain is, which a lot of people wanted to know, surprisingly. And yeah, I've been working with companies, and this is just to show you, like, I've been working in that space for some time, but it isn't part of Grow Your Own Cloud. It's always been something completely separate and in parallel. And I was always really interested in working with blockchain because it was exactly like synthetic biology. It's the future, it's coming. Right now, it's at this stage, or it was at this stage. It's accelerating pretty quickly now. But people don't really see that because they're not using it on an everyday basis. I mean, some people are using wallets, some people are buying NFTs, but it's a very, very small fraction of this room or any room. And at the same time, it is on the trajectory of the internet. And it's so funny how people have already forgotten that in like 2000, you were sitting in a room and people were saying to you, I don't really think Google's going to take off. I'm not really sure about Facebook. I was working in companies where the CEO was telling me, I'm not really sure we should invest in like Facebook or Google advertising. That doesn't make much sense. In 2010. So we're on this trajectory, it's coming, it's not going away, it's going to maybe even surpass it because the waves of acceleration are going faster. So it's important to like keep your mind on that and be part of that and try to understand what this thing is and try to shape it. And that's what I've been trying to do through What the Block. So just to give you like my kind of thoughts on this, and this is very, 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 very fast, but at a high level, what I'm interested in is talking about, like in this talk anyway, talking about Web3 and trying to stop talking about blockchain because it becomes a bit too nebulous and abstract for people to understand. But a very, very simple premise that I find works a lot with people that I teach is this notion of moving away from a relatively centralized internet of information, which is Web2, to a bit more, or a bit less centralized, a bit more decentralized internet of value. And the reason I kind of caveat decentralized and centralized is because neither of those two things are very pure. It's a scale. It's not like one, they're not binary ends of the thing. So on Web 2, which is the thing we basically use today, you've got a global network powered by computers, relatively centralized, where we send information across the internet to each other instantly. Web 3 does all of that. It's exactly the same thing, except now we can send value instantly. And I know that's very, very crude, and there's lots of things that's missing there, but that's a really, really easy way to think about what the next paradigm shift is. Shifting value onto the internet where you can exchange it peer-to-peer instantly. In a world where value, this is very important, does not equal money, and most people really struggle with that. That's a very, very difficult concept for us in an economic system, for people who've been like socialized to understand value as money to grasp, but it is not the case. So in another way, you can just think of it like this, like a shift from entering passwords onto websites to signing in via centralized entities to signing in via decentralized entities, which can also allow you to pay for stuff. And it's interesting to think about like what we are doing in Web 2, and I think we probably all know this in the room, but like just to really like reinforce it, Web 2, you are basically the product because the service is free. And that's the whole system of platform economies, Amazon, Facebook, Google, they all run the same game. They're really good at capturing value in that system because you are the product, you are generating value for them. You're also getting value from them, of course. It's a decent equation, but who's really winning? It's the monopolistic powers that are winning. And they've extracted all the value and they've become the biggest companies that have ever existed. And Web3 has the potential to shift that a little bit. I'm not saying this is some kind of panacea where everything is going to become perfect and great, because obviously it hasn't been at all. It's been quite the opposite. But I like the idea that there is potential for something different. And there's more potential for more value to be shared by the many people, where we can have a bit more decentralization, probably never complete decentralization, a bit more transparency, probably never full transparency, and a bit more open systems than we have today. And in those Web3 networks, everyone can have a little bit more of a slice of that pie, potentially, where you can be both simultaneously a product, a person, an owner, a shareholder, a creator, a governor, and all these different things at the same time, which is pretty hard to do in Web 2 or in any kind of conventional social construct. It's not something we've really tried to do. And yeah, again, like being really crude and trying to make things a bit less abstract, Web3 for me is about a new set of technologies, applications, and opportunities, rather than like spending a lot of time explaining what NFTs are or what a DAO is, because in the end, in like 5 years' time, you're not going to really care. You're just going to be using these things. You don't really know how all the protocols of the internet work, and I wish you did, but probably it's too late for that now. So what's more important is to figure out, like, what are we going to do with an NFT that's actually useful? What are we going to do with a DAO that's actually helpful? That changes anything? What can we do with DeFi that isn't a Ponzi scheme? And what can we do with decentralized science, which could actually really help change the research paradigm, which I'm very, very passionate about. So with NFTs, I think you all know them. It's really funny, actually. Recently, we were in New York announcing one of our new projects, and I realized no one knew what blockchain is, no one knew what crypto is, no one knew what Web3 is. Everybody knew what an NFT was. They didn't really know what it was. but they had heard of it and they had some sense of it. So it's actually become a really easy way to kind of like get people into talking about Web3s via these like images, because it's something easy that everyone can understand, even if they're quite crap, right? So in the end, what is an NFT? It's just a unique token, non-fungible token. And it represents ownership of a specific asset, and it lives on a blockchain. That's all you really need to care about. Like, some people think it's the artwork in itself. Of course, it's usually not. But what more people seem to talk about, especially with us, is the carbon footprints of NFTs, because there was this huge controversy last year about the footprints, and yeah, some of it's warranted, some of it's not warranted, and I'm not really going to get into that. But what I do like about NFTs, if I don't really like a lot of the things that are associated with them, is that they have some good features. You can have a really, really secure proof of ownership, a really great way of saying you're a member of something. You can create digital scarcity, which I guess you can do in anything with regards to blockchain and cryptocurrencies as well. But it's interesting to have one of something and really make it one of something. And something else which is really great is this thing called social context, which is going to be quite big. The idea that if you own an NFT that, let's say, is representational of being a member of Grow Your Own Cloud, that means you have a context to the things that Grow Your Own Cloud is related to as well. And that means you might have access to certain things and also be closed off to certain things, which is an interesting design space. The other thing that I'm really interested in at the moment, and have been for a while, is DAOs. I think TerraZero has been exploring that for a really long time. And actually, when I've been teaching, I've often used TerraZero as the really most magical example of how a DAO can be, and people really get it via the idea of the forest. So thank you for that project. And what a DAO is basically is a group, and it can be anything. It could just be a group of algorithms, actually, but they're organized around a mission. And the mission could be, let's build a data forest, for example. And they try to coordinate on a shared set of rules, and they use a blockchain to some degree. No one has really specified to what degree that must be employed. And a DAO is decentralized because it runs on a blockchain. Blockchains are typically decentralized, and it gives decision-making powers to stakeholders rather than centralized entities, board members, and so on. And it's autonomous because it uses smart contracts, so things can be triggered automatically depending on rules. So those are the words in the DAO, in the DAO. And do this again. So coming back to Grow Your Own Cloud, because we obviously went off topic there for a while, but I think you can see now how this might start relating to what we're doing. Like, how can you finance a project like Grow Your Own Cloud? How can you coordinate and build an organization? How can you bring in supports to drive the network effects? How can you govern and share value in a way that doesn't replicate the existing system? So we're now currently developing a few different things in this space. And our first thing is a product, which is a fresh take on NFTs, which is called NFPs, which are non-fungible plants. And non-fungible plants are unique plants with literally digital data inside of the plant. So that's something we've been exploring, obviously, in our work. But now we thought, well, this is quite an interesting take on an NFT. Rather than actually creating an NFT, we can make plants which are very, very similar to an NFT, and in some ways better. So, I say better. In some ways more interesting. Let's be careful here. So, NFTs, you know what they are, because I just explained them. But in contrast, an NFP is a plant. It can also be unique because we store a new file inside of it. Unlike an NFT, an NFP can grow, it lives, it dies, it reproduces through seeds, and it's a living object, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to take care of it, but if you wanted to stay alive, you probably should. And NFPs, like all plants, emit oxygen, and they remove carbon from the atmosphere, which is quite different than an NFT. So we've been thinking about what we could do with this, what kind of stories we can tell, because we can only store one file at a time, which is quite good. That's why it's an NFP. And we're thinking about working with musicians. These are not the people we're working with, but we are working with some quite well-known, not Kanye people, but relatively famous people, let's say, on putting new creations in plants and seeds. we're talking to famous artists, again, not Ai Weiwei, but again, quite famous artists about who are dealing with ecological themes and would like to work with us. And we've already started working, as you saw, with companies like LVMH, not specifically on NFPs, but that will come later down the line. And to launch this, we're using NFTs. So we're developing a literal seed round where we're releasing a set of membership seeds and people can become a member of the Grow Your Own Cloud DAO. So we're using the tools that are available in Web3 to help power our growth. And by having membership of our DAO, you get access to our products. You have access to our community, our research, because we have really cool people in our community doing really, really cool stuff. You have access to future airdrops as we develop more things. You get more value from us. You are guaranteed whitelisting for everything to do with Grow Your Own Cloud and anyone in our ecosystem, because we're part of a big ecosystem now, something called Seed Club. And you can be part of the governance. You can help steer some parts of Grow Your Own Cloud. Obviously, we're not going to open up everything because that would not be very wise. But if we're going to choose on the color of some merch, by all means, come in. And yeah, these kinds of things. And above all, these NFTs can be transformed into NFPs. And that's an important mechanism that we'll be employing. So for us, I think it's kind of clear that Web3 is something that can be an enabler. It's something useful that can help Grow Your Own Cloud literally grow. Because we're this very, very complicated, nebulous company, project, research organization, but by combining these things together, in this space, it actually starts to work and actually starts to make sense. It allows us to kind of grow a community of people who can be incentivized to help us grow, and we can bring in experts and supporters via that mechanism. We can then govern together in collaboration with the community, which is kind of good for a project like us, which requires that kind of validation. We can use NFTs as a very, very early prototype or proof of concept product to pressure test our technology in a very, very simple way, because we only have to produce very, very small numbers of the NFTs, and we can finance our work. So we're developing something right now called the NFP Garden. That's where all of this will live. And the NFP Garden is basically a space which links creators to their creations, tapping into the creator economy and allowing pieces to live across generations. And our tagline is that we're offering a clean alternative to NFTs that aren't just green, they're carbon absorbing. And it ties into this because everything we're doing with Web3 is about the evolution of Grow Your Own Cloud. We have a very, very long-term vision, and it's very similar to, I think, the work TerraZero is doing, where we started out by thinking about forests. That's our North Star. But we can't do forests right now. Even if Monica is prototyping forests in the Netherlands, we can't make a forest. We have nowhere near the technology, nowhere near the means or anything that we basically can't do it at all. But we can make NFPs. We can start there. And what's really good with that is that the public's understanding of our technology is actually really, really low. It's like in a negative territory. It's that bad. But over time, we'll be able to educate the public, grow our technology, and catch up to our ridiculous level of ambition over time, going step by step through some kind of commercial / useful to the planet process. And we have some good people supporting the project now. So Ginkgo Bioworks is a synthetic biology company helping us on this, working with MIT. We have Seed Club in the Web3 space and Polygon. We've got a really nice team that's growing, and everything is coming together in the right way around this. And I think that's why I wanted to kind of anchor this talk in showing you the journey of Grow Your Own Cloud coming into this space, because it was something it was something we spent a long time debating as people in the team. And it wasn't something that inherently made sense. It was only now, with certain tools that have become available at this point, that this project could utilize those tools to enable our vision, so that can help us get from making very, very basic art installations or products to achieving that long-term vision, which is what we're really always aiming for. Thank you. So as I said yesterday, please do follow us on our social medias and scan the QR code if you want to be on the waiting list for NFPs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cyrus. So now we have a moment for a conversation. I would like to, I'll just say a few words that were like about what was important for me in your talks. I really liked like that in your case, your project was embedded in the, maybe you can join us, yeah, here, was embedded in the physical space called trust. So, because it's a nice metaphor that we've got like a kind of automated trust embedded in the physical space called trust. And I was wondering about like social relationships and what it means if we substitute the trust that is like also super problematic in our social relationships because we try to achieve the trust and then we lose trust. But on the other hand, it's something that also gives us possibility of creating social relationships. And what happens if we have only automated trust and that we know that we can trust everybody because it is secured by smart contracts and it's something that is irreversible. So what kind of world we create if we just erase this threat of, you know, losing trust in somebody that is, on the other hand, something that gives us possibility of like creating relationships between each other. So I like this interconnection between blockchain and physical space, and like thinking about these two concepts of trust as well. And I was also thinking about one more thing, Cyrus, when we were talking about Web 3.0 and about capturing value and creating opportunities for users, and also somehow redistributing this value. I was just wondering about some serious questions. So the question about possibility of redistributing resources among the global community, if you can see, or just we can see, or if there is this hope inscribed in this project that maybe we can, thinking from the perspective of political economy, think about a serious redistribution of resources through some kind of decentralized web, or it's just a pure fantasy and it would never happen because in the end there will be certain entities that would centralize this decentralized network and make decisions instead of users. That's what's happening. That's the problem of Ethereum right now, but it's not decentralized right now, at least. So, yeah, so these were like two things that came into my mind that could be an opening for the conversation, but I would also like to invite you to join us, and maybe also you have some commentaries or some questions, or yeah. So let's make it not just asking questions, and but maybe it could be a kind of conversation between each other and open also for the public. So feel free to I don't know, to comment or to ask questions or to join us.
But there was a lot to unpack. Not sure if I can respond to all of it, but maybe I can actually first start with thanking you for your talk. It was really nice to listen to your presentation. And I think regarding like just picking up like the notion of trust, it's kind of interesting because you know, in 2015 and 16 when we discussed, or like the term decentralized autonomous organization first came about, people, including myself, were like imagining something, you know, like a completely closed off automated system, completely erasing the human out of equation. Like the first example was always like something like a fleet of self-driving cars, completely working on their own, accumulating capital, as expanding and providing a service without any human further ado. And I think this was also a time where everybody was talking about it. Yeah, but how can we make it trustless? And this doesn't work, we can't think in this direction, because this would create a possibility where something like is not absolutely defined. And I do think there's something really optimistic about this, the shifting of DAOs into a much more, I don't know, like flexible and oscillating group of people with like a joint interest. And this is like a 180 degrees turnaround to like what we started to discuss as a DAO. And I think like that's something we followed. I mean, like, because at first the TerraZero DAO was like this, the system of the like controlling the forest without any human involved. Now our art collective can be described as a DAO, maybe, or like at least we wouldn't describe it as a DAO, but like it's seen as such. And I think it's similar with your working groups and companies.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of like, we are creating a DAO now, so it just makes sense for what we're doing. And in a funny way, like the first question, or the first kind of like area around trust you brought up is what's interesting to me about DAOs, because it enables a lot of like this like liquid organization stuff that I find really, really crucial for what we're doing with Grow Your Own Cloud. People can come in and out for little projects, little interventions. They can contribute for like a month and then go back to their full-time job, because we don't have the means right now to like hire like lots and lots of people, but we do have a really like inspiring project which people want to contribute to, and they can come into something like that. There can be these systems where we kind of like automate agreements between people, and it enables us to get things done which we wouldn't have been able to do. I mean, we would have been able to do it, but it would just be much more complicated on every front, just because people wouldn't trust each other. They wouldn't trust me that I would like pay them if they did something, and I wouldn't trust them to actually do the thing. And you know, that seems like a really, really obvious thing, but it helps a project like this to grow. And when you were talking about like this idea of everything becoming trustless, and therefore we don't need to trust each other anymore, and we forget what trust is, I think it's kind of the opposite. I think I focus more now on trust, because trust becomes more flexible. There's more conditions of trust. I can set up trust for 15 minutes or a lifetime, and I can have different variable factors of trust and different types of trust that I can program and think about as part of a system, which wasn't necessarily the point before. I think before it was very much like, I trust you or I don't trust you, and it's quite binary. And now there's a different, that's definitely the sense I have of trust in that space.
I think like, you brought up debt before in there, and I think it's interesting to think of NFTs as a form of debt when joining a community, especially if you've all invested with one. So your trust, as you said, through David Grabner, is based on the debt that you've invested in this NFT. So you kind of have this mutual dependence if you're trying to create value out of something that is essentially some sort of linked asset. But like DAOs in general do sort of like try to solve this oracle problem through trustless sort of mechanisms like voting or being able to, you know, transfer said assets to each other. There's a lot of trustless mechanisms that go into it, but for all the sort of like, you know, organic oracle problems that come with trying to, you know, quantify things that are unquantifiable, you need to use these mechanisms such as voting or group consensus, and that trust is oriented through the original sort of entry into the DAO based on a sort of like individual but also communal value based on the asset that you all hold, and sort of like the extendability of, you know, where that asset can go and how you want to build out from it.
Okay, I would like to get back to trust, and I get a question. Do you trust me?
Is the question to me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, do you trust me?
To some extent.
Okay, but why?
I think it's about sharing, like as a start, like sharing apparently like an interest, like in gathering here and discussing one topic, which creates for me like a baseline for some sort of trust.
Okay, do you trust me?
Yes, for similar reasons. Also, I mean, you sat here to watch this talk for a little bit, so time is trust, I guess, as a form.
Okay. Cyrus, do you trust me?
Time. If somebody spends time listening or paying attention to you, that's sort of like low-level trust. But yes.
It's quite easy to get the trust there.
It depends so much. I mean, over time, yeah. It's exponential, I guess, but...
Yeah.
Cyrus, do you trust me?
So like it's a cultural thing, yeah? So
Yeah.
my mum's
Be honest.
Indian, and I was told like don't trust anybody. So like honestly, I think that's really important to as part of this. Like when working in these like global systems, every culture has such a different approach to trust for obvious reasons as well. There's like I've lived in Denmark where it's just insane, like the level of trust in everything is just above the roof. And then you go to other countries and no one trusts anybody or anything. So yeah, I mean, part of me does and a lot of me doesn't.
Okay. Because I don't trust you guys. I don't know you. Sorry. And I know Bartek. I know you because we know each other. We talk a lot, and we have some projects in common. And I think like we base the assumption of trust of the assets and everything, but not on the identity and like the whole concept of the Web3 and everything that is totally. Anonymous, right? And I think the point is missing here that we were talking also about the Bitcoin and everything, and the crucial aspect here is the way of consensus, right? And I'm a huge fan of let's say a proof of authority, that there is like some bigger entity, right, that actually give the proof that I'm a correct person that have an ability to join the network. And blockchain also has like a really amazing opportunity to build a database. For example, there's a cool project for kids that they are pretending to protecting kids from the trafficking, so they have a proof that they are real persons and they are really like they can join the network. So I think the point is missing here, that again is a human aspect, right? That we focus so much on assets and everything around, but I think a blockchain has it's a very powerful tool, but we again using it kind of out of the context. So I imagine if we could have like kind of a network when I can prove that I'm Joanna, I can show you my ID or anything else, or there would be like a bigger entity that could approve that I'm the person, and when you can look for me, how you can actually kind of, I don't know, if I do something wrong, I'm gonna steal your asset or anything that can protect me from that. Because like whenever I hear the stories about Web3, it's like some kind of the opposite system that is fully automized. But I think we should look for something middle, something more balanced, that we all, of course, we can have like a smart contracts and everything around, but we also need like a strong policy that take care of this technology.
That's the Web 5 thing, right? Have you heard about this? The Jack Dorsey thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like what you're describing, but at the same time, like it sounds like you are saying that, well, I think what we were just saying right now was that a lot of things that are happening in Web3 are very, very human. It's very much less autonomous and decentralized than people thought it was going to be in 2016 and 2017. And like that's definitely my feeling. It's very much more human now, and I like that. I like the fact that it doesn't have to be as polarized. It doesn't have to be so pure. It can be like, yeah, we can have a DAO, but it doesn't adhere to every single principle of what the original DAO was. It can just be a way of organizing. To some degree, we use a little bit of blockchain here and there, and it helps us for certain reasons. But it doesn't have to be like completely autonomous, because it doesn't work for us. That wouldn't be useful in any way.
I mean, there are a lot of problems with sort of identity on the networks, especially, I went through this phase where I created like 6 wallets on Ethereum because I wanted to have different identities for different platforms. And since wallet is identity there, you kind of have to be careful about what you do because it's all transparent. Exactly. People can be like, oh, you've done a bunch of crazy shit or something, and like, oh, I don't like that you interacted with that NFT project or something like this. And it's kind of not really taught that your wallet is your identity, so a lot of people just like contain their entire existence on this network within there. But then there's also like, yeah, a lot of people identify as their NFT profile picture, you know? So like their base identity is like, you know, scrubbed from their Ethereum wallet, and they identify as like whatever NFT project that they're into. But there's other things that like, I think like Proof of Humanity, there's some other things where they do these like group identity sessions where they all show their faces on the camera to try to create like a base level identity. So there are some protocols that are trying to do this, but they're not that elegant, and I don't know, they sort of work, put it that way. But I think there is like a lot of work to be done when it comes to somehow also enabling some sort of privacy when it comes to doing that, especially since like blockchain is so transparent. And putting your identity and linking it with your wallet and all your transactions and all your sort of like, you know, economic activity is kind of dangerous.
Yeah, but because you're looking at blockchain from the like a perspective of open database, and if you could develop your own blockchain, it's limited for people who are actually working in your group, in your community. So it's like the aspects of the privacy is actually covered in that field.
Yeah,
I think like, we are really not interested in like private blockchains, because we do think if you have like a centralized authority like curating a blockchain, then you should just use like a normal database. This is well proven, it works, it's cheap, it's energy efficient, and if you there's no need for a blockchain from our perspective. If you like an internal like company blockchain or something, for us this is mostly feeding into BuzzFeed news to claim to use new tech. Regarding the identification, I do agree there's something uncanny about, but I do think there's something really progressive about allowing for non-rigid forms of identity, to allow to reinvent yourself. If you look at like the early internet days and like how this new form of anonymity sparked like a rise of so many important subcultures and so many progressive movements which would never have been formed without this safe space of being able to choose a new form of identity, of something else which you just like got on a plastic card by like a national state. I do know that there's like risk with it, and it can turn into like it can cause safety problems. But I do want to also stress out that like it's also like a very dystopian vision to have like one digital identity which is globally defined, which is like completely transparent, so you can't hide, and you never can erase or redefine it. So I'm like a little bit skeptical about like this. How is this project called? With like this orb?
Which one?
Do you know?
That's the iScanner orb.
Oh yeah.
There's like this one blockchain project which wants to create this solution, and they propose to distribute NFTs, like one unique NFTs per person. Like it's like proof of person, I think. Yeah. And then they have like, I don't know if it's even speculative, or they have like an iris scanner which you hold to your eye, and then it like creates a checksum of your iris, and then creates. Ridiculous. And I do think there's like something really dystopian. I think there are like many 80s science fiction books about what can go wrong about this.
It's WorldCoin, isn't it?
Yeah, I think
something like that.
Yeah, I have a question, a comment. First, thank you very much for the presentations, both of them. I enjoyed them very much, not just for the questions that they force us to ask, but also for the tension that they're creating in asking some of these questions. And I can see how some people would be uncomfortable with some of these ideas. So I wanted to hear your response to the critique that, you know, this really sort of enforces a neoliberal approach of privatizing the natural domain and the public domain, right? Basically what's happening here is you're taking things that are outside of the market, plants, and bringing them into the market. How would you respond to that kind of critique? Thank you.
This is like a very big question. It's also important that we now talk as artists, you know, like working also, and creating also like provocative artworks as a means of artistic production. But I do think, or I would argue against it and said that there is no plant out there which exists outside of economic relations. I think even if it's like a natural preserve, then there's like some entity, if it's a state, a private company, which pays for it and says, okay, I won't exploit this, so it's like a negative revenue, a negative profit, in order to profit from this different, because it is important for an ecological balance, or even because it protects the climate, or it's like of recreational value. A good example is that the water supply of New York actually invested heavily in natural preserves on top of the city, just because they did the math, and these ecosystems were about to collapse. And if they would collapse, then they would have to build 5 new clearing facilities. And they just like calculated it and said, okay, the service, like this functioning ecosystem as like a non-exploited or non-visually exploited area is more profitable than like us counterbalancing it with like artificial infrastructure. And like that's like with working with TerraZero, I think our job is to make it clear that to look for like these dependencies and like uncover them and then criticize them. And it's important, but before that you have to accept that they are there and that you have to acknowledge them.
Okay, so because we are now very, very, very late beyond the time, so I would like to thank you so much for your presentations, for the super interesting conversation, and thank you for the participation in this conversation. And I hope we can continue it also in a less formal way, like at lunch or later. And now let's make a 15 minutes break. And let's come back at 1:20, and then we'll dive into the new extractivism topic, and we'll have a talk by Vladan Joler. So thank you so much, and we are meeting here in 15 minutes.